course, in the Make America Great Again movement, there is a strong form of isolationism. They don't want to have what they call forever wars. Yet here, you have JD Vance, who's probably been the biggest critic in terms of members of the cabinet of Ukraine support, of bailing out Europeans. If you think about that Signal chat many months ago, saying that he cannot think of a better use of the American army than ultimately policing its border and cracking down on the cartel.
Will Donald Trump go to war against Venezuela? The US president is, perhaps not for the first time, sending mixed signals, saying both that Nicolas Maduro's days as leader are numbered, but that he doubts war is imminent. The US has been amassing military units in the Caribbean and has conducted multiple strikes on ships suspected of involvement in drug trafficking. Well, I'm joined now by the Washington editor for The Times, Katy, and also by The Times Latin American correspondent Stephen Gibbs. Hello to both of you.
Hi.
No.
Stephen, I'll start with you. Look, there's no doubt that the US military has been building up its forces in the Caribbean Sea in a big way, as well as authorizing covert CIA operations inside the country. Is there?
There's no doubt about the buildup of the ships off Venezuela, really in the Caribbean. Most of them are in Puerto Rico. There's no question this is sort of unprecedented, and there's never been as big a buildup as this since the Cold War, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, to be precise. In terms of covert action inside Venezuela, who knows? I mean, the rather extraordinary thing was, of course, Trump said, yes, there is covert action, covert operatives inside the country, a rather odd thing for a president to say. But no, generally, it's completely clear that these are unprecedented times, and we just have to see what happens next, really, whether Trump, so to speak, pulls the trigger.
Yeah, sure. And look, I mean, he says that it's all happening to stem the flow of drugs into the United States, which is a huge problem. But is that the whole story?
I think it's part of the story. I think, particularly if you look in the last few days and sort of week or so, a lot of these strikes on boats, which are sort of small speedboats that clearly, some of them are, or all of them are carrying drugs. Some of those have been in the Eastern Pacific off Mexico. So the idea that this was all a sort of incremental move to get closer and closer towards Venezuela and scare the pants off, frankly, President Maduro, that's not the full story. It is definitely partly an action against drug trafficking. But the point is that the United States has declared that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is a narco-terrorist. It has placed a $50 million bounty on information leading to his arrest. They've made it clear that they feel that a big cartel or several cartels are operating in this region, and one of them is led by Nicolas Maduro. That is a very uncomfortable position for anyone, whether or not he's a president of a country, to be in.
Katy, what's the White House saying about the possibility of strikes on land?
It's been floated. There was a report recently suggesting action was imminent that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, disputed, saying that the journalists had not got the correct information. But certainly there have been times when Donald Trump is quite keen to lean into this. They quite enjoy the narrative of, we could do X and Y. If you think about the videos, not on land, but of, the vessels, boats, submarines, what you call them, where they say this is to do narcotics, they will often release those videos saying, unclassified, to show American might and to play to it. And I think what's interesting in terms of the politics around this is, as you say, they link it to the cartels, but it means that, of course, in the Make America Great Again movement, there is a strong form of isolationism. They don't want to have what they call forever wars. Yet here, you have JD Vance, who's probably been the biggest critic in terms of members of the cabinet of Ukraine support, of bailing out Europeans. If you think about that Signal chat many months ago, saying that he cannot think of a better use of the American army than ultimately policing its border and cracking down on the cartels. So it has a domestic audience in that sense. However, it doesn't go. There are still limits and where it splinters the Republican base, because you have some calling for regime change. And that's where you'll start to get some in the MAGA movement saying, hold on a minute. We like the idea of stopping the cartels. We like the idea of these strikes and how you share them. But if you're really planning to have regime change, that starts to get more messy, and there's more pushback on that.
The strikes on vessels, they are legally contentious, controversial, shall we say, to say the least. Is there any pushback on that from in the usual kind of sort of political channels in the United States?
Well, you have lots of figures saying this seems completely illegal and Donald Trump is acting beyond what his executive power and so forth gives him. You have the White House saying they're not paying any attention to that and that, that it is within their limits. I think probably the most interesting pushback is Congress, some Republicans saying we need to have more checks if it looks as though the US is going to keep doing this and also potentially take us into a longer military conflict. So far, they haven't had that much cut through. And of course, the government is currently shut down in DC. But it is something where you have Democrats and Republicans raising concerns about the legal basis for it, and also where Trump will go next if he's already taking such, strong actions which are being questioned.
And when it comes to Maduro, Stephen, what's his response been so far?
Well, he's said that he's going to arm civilians in this country. Whether he actually can do this, you have to bear in mind Venezuela. I mean, part of the whole problem of this is a country that's had this catastrophic decline of 75% of its GDP over the last decade. But Maduro says, we will fight back. We're putting anti-aircraft missiles on the coasts, etc. The reality, of course, is if the US take this to its conclusion, it has an army, obviously a military that's by far the strongest in the world. There's not much that Maduro can do. He is trying to get regional support, which he is getting to a certain extent, particularly from Colombia next door, from President Petro there, that's also actually being targeted or labeled as a drug leader by Trump. Brazil is pretty uncomfortable with these strikes just on the boats in the Caribbean. One thing worth pointing out is so far, it isn't on land. And if you look at the wording of all these strikes, every time they happen, the US authorities say it happened in international waters. They make that completely clear that they're not yet escalating. So this is their problem. If they want to take this to the land, there's no man's land. They are attacking a sovereign country, and we are waiting to see if they dare take that step.
And how popular is Maduro at home? Is there a significant constituency in Venezuela that yearns for his overthrow?
Well, we had elections here last year in 2024, and if you take what most people do, the result which the opposition published on the basis of electoral slips from voting machines, official election sort of receipts, the opposition got 67%, even in a very difficult election for them without access to mass media, etc. So, you hear on the streets people say, that election spoke for itself. Now, the government says it won the election. Maduro says he won comfortably and has been in power, obviously, ever since. So their argument is that, the institutions in Venezuela, which of course they control, have spoken, and, any attempt to unseat him is a disgraceful attempt of regime change that the US has got a not particularly glorious history of being behind. But that election, of course, was a pretty powerful message of the level of popularity for Maduro.
You reported, Stephen, recently on a American plot to bribe Maduro's pilot and get him to turn the president in. It was a remarkable story. Can you remind our listeners of exactly what happened there?
Well, yes, you get the impression that the United States is searching for a simple solution here. It really doesn't want to go to war with Venezuela. And yes, it wants to get Maduro out of power. What's a weak link in the chain? Well, one that did emerge, actually, in the end, it didn't emerge, but one that they considered was his personal pilot. And it seemed what was seen as a possible opportunity when one of the presidential planes was being serviced in the Dominican Republic. There was the presidential pilot and a few other pilots getting ready to take the plane back to Venezuela. And an attaché who worked at the US Embassy in the Dominican Republic, got an opportunity to talk to that pilot and try and persuade him. We're not quite clear how much money was offered or anything, but remember, 50 million is on the table to bring Maduro to justice. Try and persuade him to perhaps divert the plane and take it to somewhere else without his passenger knowing. the pilot declined. There were some conversations, but he, in the end, made it quite clear that he was completely not prepared to do that. He's since been presented on Venezuelan television as a hero and a patriot and an example. The Venezuelans will say that this idea that you can get the military here or anyone to turn against the president is a sort of forlorn hope. That's how they're spinning it.
Fascinating. Katy, look, other Latin American leaders, as Stephen said, including Colombia's President Petro, have criticized the US as, trying to embark upon a form of regional domination. Are there concerns in Washington that this could be damaging America's influence in South America generally?
I think it depends who you speak to, because there are some around Donald Trump who see this and Venezuela being one part of it as a wider pivot, where America is moving to really policing its own backyard, is how it's been put to me, and a slight redrawing of the map, whereby they would say that in a decade's time, they'd want a world where America is not at all involved in Europe or, countries further away, but instead has almost sealed itself away from the world by making sure everywhere that is near America is in its control. And you can see it, for example, Argentina and the bailout for Malay. If you look at Brazil and, how they don't like the leader there, so you take action on tariffs. It's certainly a very interventionist approach to the Americas. And for example, Steve Bannon, the former White House strategist, said to me, well, he's always taken the view, having worked with Trump for a period, that when Trump talks about America first, he does mean the Americas, because he thinks that's how you eventually get there. So there are definitely people who will look at this and say, this is bad for what he's doing, the reputation. But I think for the Trump administration and that side of politics, this is part of a longer plan. They want to be more involved.
And Stephen, presumably, roughly the same question to you, but in sort of Mexico and points south, there are presumably all kinds of people who aren't wild about being America's backyard.
Oh, definitely. This is that there are countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, to a lesser extent, Colombia, that have a very, very strong sort of anti-American tradition there and feeling. So yeah, he has to tread carefully. But I totally agree with what Katy said. Is that the sort of ideology behind this is that you're either with us or you're against us, and they feel that the Venezuelan government here is a sort of big problem for them and the region that they would love to solve. And, they just wish they could solve it simply. If they could sort of press a button and it would all change, as of course the opposition here also hopes, they would love to be able to do that. But of course, life is a lot more complicated. And the other detail, I think, not detail, the important factor here, of course, is oil. Venezuela has the highest proven reserves of oil in the world. The idea that those reserves are not automatically and easily traded with the United States because it has such a problematic government from the US point of view is also a big issue in this.
Katy, and then I guess a final question to you. But when we turning back to the kind of the stated pretext for all this, which is the war on drugs, how politically important is that Donald Trump does something about the flow of drugs into America? How politically salient is the flow of drugs, and particularly South American drugs, into America?
So I think it is salient, and I also think it's an issue where it isn't just confined to one area. It's not as though this is just these working class areas where MAGA feels it's changing the map, though that is an aspect, but it's also a story in the much more wealthy areas. When you speak to Americans here about fentanyl, they was so we all I was speaking to someone who wasn't particularly supportive of Trump, who was saying they cheer when they see these being struck because everyone knows someone who's been affected by this, perhaps passed away by a fentanyl. But then I do think there's a point, which is in lots of the towns where they've really had their, changed the type of voter that perhaps vote Republican, those particularly working class areas where the jobs have been going, it is a big issue there. And that's why I think figures like J.D. Vance feel that it goes right to the heart of America in terms of stopping it.
Katy Balls, Stephen Gibbs, thank you both very much indeed.